In the quiet town of Bastrop, Texas, April 23, 1996, began like any ordinary day. But by morning's end, the small community would be shaken by the discovery of a young woman's body lying on a remote dirt road. A discovery that would ignite one of the most controversial murder cases in modern American history. Her name was Stacey Stites. She was just 19 years old, a bright high school graduate working at a local grocery store, engaged to a police officer named Jimmy Fennell, and just weeks away from her wedding. To everyone who knew her, she represented small-town innocence, hope, promise, and the quiet simplicity of rural life. But when her body was found, everything changed. The brutality of the crime, sexual assault, and strangulation sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. Almost immediately, suspicion turned toward anyone outside the expected circle. And soon, investigators set their sights on a name that would become infamous across the nation: Rodney Reed. A young black man from the same county, Reed had a record of minor offenses, but no history of violence. Yet within weeks, his life would spiral into a nightmare of accusations, courtroom battles, and years on death row, all hinging on a single piece of disputed evidence. The investigation began with local law enforcement, but from the start, it raised troubling questions. Stacey's fiancé, Officer Fennell, told police she had left early that morning for work, but never arrived. The truck she drove, his truck, was later found abandoned near a high school, and inside, investigators noticed signs that didn't align neatly with the timeline Fennell gave. Fibers, fingerprints, and inconsistencies began to surface. But instead of toning suspicion inward, attention quickly shifted to Reed, after DNA evidence recovered from Stacey's body was matched to him. The revelation hit the community hard. To prosecutors, it seemed straightforward. Reed's DNA was found. Therefore, he must have been the killer. But Reed insisted he was innocent. That he and Stacey had been involved in a consensual relationship, one kept secret because of the racial and social tensions of the time. Stacey was a white woman, and Rodney was black. In 1990s Texas, that alone was dangerous knowledge. Still, investigators rejected that claim. They treated the DNA match not as evidence of a relationship, but as proof of rape and murder. What followed was a whirlwind prosecution. The narrative built by the state was simple and powerful. A black man sexually assaulted and killed a white woman who was engaged to a white police officer. The jury, predominantly white, heard little about Fennell's behavior, his past, or his alibi. They heard nothing about his violent reputation or the history of controlling tendencies that others around him had quietly noted. Instead, the focus was laser-sharp on Reed. The trial in 1998 was swift. Despite weak physical evidence connecting Reed to the murder beyond the DNA sample, despite the absence of clear signs of a struggle consistent with a violent rape, and despite the questionable timeline presented by prosecutors, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Rodney Reed was sentenced to death. For the next 2 decades, his life was confined to a 6-by-9-foot cell on Texas's death row. Yet even as the walls closed in, his voice grew louder. Over the years, a growing number of journalists, attorneys, and activists began to examine his case, and what they found raised serious doubts. New witnesses came forward, stating that Stacey and Rodney had indeed been in a relationship, often meeting in secret. One coworker recalled Stacey confiding that she was seeing someone she shouldn't be. Others described seeing the two together at local spots. But perhaps most striking were the revelations about Fennell himself. After the trial, he was later convicted in a separate case for kidnapping and sexually assaulting a woman while on duty as a police officer. The similarities in behavior were chilling. Reed's defense argued that this was not coincidence, it was a pattern. Visual reenactments here would show the parallel. Courtroom sketches dissolving into footage of dusty Bastrop roads. Evidence photos fading into images of news headlines calling for justice. Narration could guide viewers through the contrast. The cold certainty of the original verdict against the slow unraveling of its credibility. Over time, forensic science itself began to challenge the state's version of events. Experts re-examined the physical evidence and concluded that the state's timeline, placing Stacey's death around 3 a.m., didn't match the biological evidence. Her body temperature, lividity patterns, and other data suggested she might have died much earlier, possibly while still at home or near someone she knew. That change in timing, if true, could completely exonerate Rodney. It would mean Stacey was killed before she even left home, at a time when Fennell admitted being the last person to see her alive. But despite these mounting questions, appeals after appeals were denied. Texas's system, known for its harsh finality, rarely revisited old convictions. Reed's execution was scheduled multiple times. Each time, hope flickered and faded, until 2019, when the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a stay of execution, just days before his scheduled death. The nation watched. Protests erupted outside the governor's mansion. Celebrities, politicians, and civil rights organizations rallied behind Reed. Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, and the Innocence Project helped amplify his story, shining a national spotlight on the cracks in the case. But behind the public outcry was something deeper, an uncomfortable reflection on race, justice, and the legacy of bias in America's legal system. How could a case with so many unanswered questions lead to the brink of execution? What does justice look like when the system refuses to admit it may have erred? For those watching, it wasn't just about Rodney Reed. It was about every person caught in the machinery of a system that sometimes values closure over truth. The courtroom battles continued. Lawyers pushed for DNA testing on key evidence that had never been examined. Stacey's clothing, the belt used as a murder weapon, and items from the truck. These tests, they argued, could finally reveal whether someone else's DNA was present. Yet the state resisted. For years, they refused additional testing, claiming the evidence had already been examined sufficiently. Viewers might imagine here a visual put to sterile forensic labs, evidence bags labeled with dates from the 1990s, dust settling on old boxes in dimly lit archives, symbols of a justice system frozen in time. By 2021, the U.S. Supreme Court intervened to review whether Reed had the right to pursue DNA testing through civil rights claims. It was a narrow procedural issue, but for Rodney, it was everything. In 2023, the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, affirming his right to challenge the state's refusal to test the evidence. It wasn't freedom, but it was hope. A new door opened. The significance of that ruling extended far beyond his case. It set a precedent. Death row inmates could seek DNA testing as a matter of civil rights when state procedures blocked access to potential proof of innocence. It reminded the nation that the justice system must remain accountable to truth, not just to final judgments. For Reed's family, that hope had been a long time coming. His mother, Sandra Reed, spent decades fighting for her son's life. Every stay of execution, every hearing, every protest, She was there. Her resilience became the emotional anger of the movement. In interviews, she spoke not with bitterness, but with faith and determination. She believed her son would come home. Those moments, portrayed through voice actor readings of her words over archival footage, would strike the emotional center of this story. She often said, "They can take his freedom, but they can't take his spirit." Over the years, Reed became a symbol of endurance, of wrongful conviction, of the fragility of justice when bias is allowed to shape truth. And while his case remains ongoing, the transformation is undeniable. He is no longer just an inmate number on death row. He is a man whose story sparked a national conversation about fairness, accountability, and the limits of human judgment. The visual sequence here would shift toward hope. News footage of supporters holding signs reading "Justice for Rodney Reed," families praying outside courthouses, candlelight vigils illuminating faces filled with resolve. These scenes represent not just a fight for one man's life, but a collective stand for the idea that justice must evolve. As of today, Rodney Reed's execution remains stayed. New evidence continues to be evaluated. Courts are still deliberating whether the forensic gaps, withheld testimonies, and allegations against Ginny Fennell amount to the miscarriage of justice Reed's defenders claim. But regardless of the outcome, the case has already reshaped how the public sees Texas's death penalty system. It has forced hard questions about race, power, and truth. And it has shown that behind every file, every headline, and every case number, there are lives. Families who carry the weight of the system's decisions every day. As the story closes, we return to the man at the center of it all, Rodney Reed. Now in his mid-50s, sits in a cell that has been both a cage and a classroom. He writes letters, studies his case, prays. To him, the struggle is no longer only about proving innocence. It's about what truth means when the world stops listening. And to those who believe in his cause, his survival represents more than a legal victory. It's proof that persistence can bend even the hardest walls of injustice. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive all at once. It comes slowly, through voices that refuse to be silenced, through families that never give up, and through a system that piece by piece learns to look itself in the mirror. So as the camera fades on the quiet corridors of Texas's death row, the question remains for every viewer. If the system can come so close to taking an innocent life, how many others still wait unseeing, unheard, and unresolved? And what will we, as a society, do to ensure the next Rodney Reed is not another name we mourn, but a life we save in time?